The ancient origins of soul judgment concepts. Have you ever wondered about the historical origins of the concept of judgment after death? That idea, present in various religious traditions, where the soul undergoes evaluation and final destiny. Today, we're exploring one of the oldest sources of these concepts, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which predates by millennia many spiritual traditions we know today. Long before the development of Christianity and Islam, the ancient Egyptians already had detailed texts about the soul's journey after death. And what's fascinating is that when we study comparative religious history, we find remarkable parallels between these ancient Egyptian traditions and teachings that later appear in other cultures. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, whose original name is Book of Coming Forth by Day, is a collection of funerary texts that served as a spiritual guide. These texts taught about crossing the Duat, the underworld, and culminated in the famous judgment in the Hall of Two Truths. There, according to Egyptian belief, the deceased's heart was weighed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at, goddess of truth and justice. A heart too heavy would be devoured by Ammit, a mythical creature. This concept of weighing the soul finds interesting parallels in later traditions. The Day of Judgment in Christianity, where actions are evaluated before God, and the Islamic concept of judgment, where good and bad deeds are weighed before Allah, share this symbolic structure of moral evaluation. Historians of religion have been studying these connections for decades. But here's an important academic question. How did these ideas circulate between ancient cultures? The Egyptians documented these concepts in detail, including names of guardians, ritual words, and precise instructions. This knowledge was transmitted through papyri placed in tombs. The question that interests us from a historical perspective is, why is Egyptian influence on the formation of Western religious concepts so little discussed in traditional religious education? Scholars like Jan Assmann and Eric Horning have demonstrated important cultural connections between ancient Egypt and the later development of religious ideas in the Mediterranean world. The historical truth is that human spirituality developed through complex cultural exchanges. Egypt was a knowledge center in the ancient world, influencing Greeks, Romans, and Semitic peoples. When we study sacred texts from a religious history perspective, we perceive fascinating patterns of cultural transmission. So I invite you to explore with me this journey through the Egyptian Book of the Dead from an academic and respectful perspective. What we'll discover can broaden our understanding of how spiritual concepts evolved across cultures. If this topic interests you, hit that like button. And in the comments, write Mot to show you want to learn more about these historical connections. Subscribe to the channel for more educational content on religious history, how the Egyptians structured their afterlife concepts. Now that we've established the historical context, let's deepen our comparative analysis. We're not talking about vague coincidences, but documented patterns that historians and anthropologists of religion have been studying for generations. The academic question is, how did these cultural transmissions occur? Let's look at the historical data. The Book of the Dead wasn't a single text, but a collection of papyri with different versions. Some contained over 200 chapters, others were summaries. All shared the purpose of guiding the deceased in the post-death journey. In Egyptian thought, death was transformation. The soul divided into Ka life force, Ba personality, and Ak illuminated form. The Egyptian judgment was visually described in tomb paintings, Anubis conducting the soul, Thoth recording the result, Osiris presiding as judge. And there's a particularly interesting element, the negative confession, a list of 42 declarations where the soul affirmed not having committed certain acts. I have not killed. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not committed adultery. Scholars of Abrahamic religions note structural similarities with the Ten Commandments and other later moral codes. Egyptologist Jan Assmann argues that there exists a cultural memory connecting these traditions. The structure of moral accountability, the idea of universal law, the symbolic weight of actions, these concepts were already systematized in ancient Egypt. In spell 125 of the Book of the Dead, the soul declares its innocence and seeks access to the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, a place without hunger, thirst, or suffering, where one lives eternally in peace. Academically, we observe parallels with descriptions of paradise in later traditions, the Jewish Gan Eden, the Christian concept of heaven, the Islamic Jannah. And what about the opposite fate? The soul that failed judgment would face total annihilation. This concept of final destruction or eternal punishment also appears, with variations, in later traditions. The Jewish Gehenna, Christian hell, Islamic Jahannam all represent consequences for moral transgressions. The academic question isn't whether one religion is true or false, but how religious ideas circulate and transform across cultures. Religious historian Mircea Eliade demonstrated that spiritual archetypes appear in different traditions, with local variations. Egypt, as one of the first great civilizations to systematize these ideas in writing, became an important source of cultural influence. So how did these ideas travel from Egypt to other cultures? That's what we'll explore next, based on historical and archaeological evidence. If you're following this historical analysis, leave your like, comment scale to show you understand the importance of this cross-cultural symbolism. Subscribe for more educational content. The historical roots of cultural transmission from Egypt to the world. We've reached the point where historical analysis becomes truly fascinating. How did ideas from the Egyptian Book of the Dead find their way into other religious traditions? The answer lies in documented historical processes of cultural exchange, not in conspiracy theories. Let's look at verifiable historical facts. Egypt wasn't isolated, it was a cultural, commercial, and religious powerhouse. Greeks studied in Alexandria, Romans admired Egyptian wisdom, and the Hebrews, according to biblical narratives, lived in Egypt for significant periods. Moses, according to the biblical text, was educated in the Egyptian court. Religious historian Thomas Romer, from Calgide, France, argues that early Judaism was influenced by the Egyptian and Mesopotamian cultural context. When Moses presents the Ten Commandments, he brings structured moral law. The Egyptians already had the negative confession over 1,000 years earlier. Placing the texts side by side reveals notable structural similarities. The concept of resurrection, central to Christianity, has antecedents in the myth of Osiris. Killed and resurrected by Isis, Osiris became Lord of the Dead and Supreme Judge. Egyptologist Eric Horning documented how this narrative of divine death and rebirth circulated through the ancient Mediterranean world, influencing various traditions. As for Islam, Muhammad lived in a time of intense cultural exchange between Arabia, Egypt, and the Byzantine Empire. The Quran describes the Day of Judgment, the scale of actions, recording angels, paradise with eternal gardens, and hell with unquenchable fire. Scholars of Islam recognize influences from earlier traditions, including elements of Judaism, Christianity, and Middle Eastern cultures. Why isn't this more widely taught? This is a question of religious pedagogy versus academic history of religions. Religious institutions traditionally emphasize their narratives of unique revelation, while historians study cultural processes of idea development and transmission. Religious historian Jonathan Z. Smith observed that all religious traditions are cultural constructions that evolve through time, adapting and reinterpreting earlier elements. This doesn't diminish their spiritual value for practitioners, it just contextualizes their historical development. The early church fathers themselves, like Clement of Alexandria and Origen, studied Egyptian and Greek philosophy. They knew about Hermes, Trismegistus, and the mysteries of Isis. Over time, the church chose to emphasize its distinction from pagan traditions. A similar process occurred in early Islam, which defined its identity in relation to earlier traditions. Cultural memory was edited over the centuries. Influences were minimized in official narratives. Egypt became mainly a biblical setting location of the Exodus, not the source of fundamental concepts about life after death. But modern historical and archaeological research recovers these connections. The papyri are preserved. The hieroglyphs have been deciphered. Anyone with access to academic research can study the evidence. If this historical analysis makes sense to you, leave your like, Comment Osiris to show you're following this journey through historical knowledge. Subscribe for more educational content based on academic research, what we can learn from studying these historical connections. We've reached the point where you can make a choice about how to approach religious knowledge. You can study only within the traditional narratives of each religion, or you can adopt a comparative religious history perspective, recognizing that human spirituality developed through complex and interconnected cultural processes. The Egyptian Book of the Dead is documented historical evidence, texts that survived millennia, symbols that crossed civilizations, concepts that shaped the development of spiritual traditions. Understanding this broadens our perspective on how religions formed historically. The Book of the Dead wasn't closed dogma. It was knowledge that could be personalized. Those who had resources would have customized papyri copied. There were spells for protection, transformation, passage. It was spiritual technology developed over centuries of Egyptian religious tradition. Modern religions, on the other hand, generally establish more hierarchical institutional structures. There are intermediaries, priests, religious leaders who interpret sacred texts. This is natural in the development of organized religious institutions. Egypt also had its priestly hierarchy, but it also preserved a tradition of accessible funerary texts. The Book of the Dead reminds us that the spiritual journey involves personal quest for wisdom and understanding. Egyptian judgment wasn't about blindly following rules, but about living with truth, justice, cosmic balance. This is a sophisticated ethical concept. What to do with this historical knowledge? First, study with reliable academic sources. Read translations of the Book of the Dead by recognized Egyptologists. Compare with analyses by historians of religion. Second, develop critical thinking about religious history. Third, recognize that you're part of a lineage of spiritual seeking that spans millennia. The Book of the Dead isn't an end, but a key to understanding processes of religious tradition formation. It's evidence that ancient wisdom influenced later developments. Concepts transform, adapt, reinvent themselves across cultures, but fundamental patterns about morality, judgment, and transcendence persist. The scale remains a powerful symbol. The judgment of the soul remains an archetype. The search for light, for truth, for justice remains a universal human aspiration. These themes appear in virtually all religious traditions, with specific cultural variations. Academic research on religious history doesn't need to destroy personal faith, it can enrich it with deeper historical context. Many scholars of religion are also religious practitioners. Historical knowledge and spiritual practice can coexist. Egypt taught us that death, in the spiritual perspective, isn't an end, it's transformation. The soul seeks to become illuminated. Keep studying, questioning, seeking knowledge with an open mind and critical spirit. If this educational journey was valuable to you, leave your comment light to show you value historical knowledge about spirituality. Subscribe to the channel for more content based on academic research on religious history. Share with others who are also interested in these topics.